Well, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to volunteer for a mission to the space station, provided that Colonel Dutton will fly me there. 40 years ago on Christmas Eve, my wife and I watched spellbound as Apollo 8 circled the moon. And crystal clear the words came through the intervening space. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I could feel the hair rising on the back of my neck. Massive technological achievement, coupled with one of the most ancient statements in all of literature, but perfectly appropriate. No sense of dissonance, no sense of distance. Science and belief in God perfectly welded together. And that image stands with me as I think of the tragic irony of our 21st century in the West, where some of the cleverest people in the world are devoting their lives to deleting God from the equation of meaning and morality. Brilliant physicist Stephen Hawking opines that Christianity is a fairy story for those people afraid of the dark. So it may be if God does not exist. But if God does exist, ladies and gentlemen, as I pointed out in the Times in my rejoinder to Hawking, then atheism looks very much like a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Statements by scientists are not always statements of science. And our problem, and the nettle we need to grasp, is that the authority of science is being misused. I'm passionate about science, but I'm also passionate about grasping the nettle of its abuse. In what we now call scientism, the idea that science has answers to all questions. Richard Dawkins claims that God is a delusion. And in his book, he defines a delusion to be a false belief held in the face of strong evidence to the contrary. I believe that the grip of naturalism in our culture is propped up by a series of atheist delusions that we need to expose, a patch of nettles that we need to grasp. And the first of them has been referred to tonight. It is that science and God are at war. Physics Nobel laureate Steven Weinberg puts it very aggressively. The world needs to wake up from the long nightmare of religion. Anything that we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done, and may in fact be our greatest contribution to civilization. That sounds both sinister and totalitarian. And the New Scientist 3 weeks ago, its cover, World Without God, and a very antiquated picture of a light switch in a church with a tacky little piece of sticky tape saying, could the last person to leave the church please turn out the lights? And the impression is given that Christianity, belief in God, has had their day, and science is taking over with its supreme authority. And so Weinberg and people like him give the public the impression that this is a battle between science and faith in God, but that cannot be the case. Peter Higgs, to the delight of all Scots, won the Nobel Prize for Physics last year. Peter is an atheist. A few years ago, William Phillips, an American, won exactly the same prize, and he's a Christian. And that ought to show us clearly that the battle is not between science and faith in God, because here's two Nobel Prize winners. Their science doesn't divide them. What does divide them is their worldview. I believe that the battle at the heart of Western civilization is a truth battle, and it's a worldview battle. Everybody in this room has a worldview. Our answers to the big questions of life. And competing, particularly in the Western Academy, are the worldviews of naturalism, that nature is all there is, with the worldview of theism, Christian theism in my case, that there is a God who created and sustains our universe. And we need to grasp the nettle of explanation to get across the fact that it's a worldview battle and not a battle between science and faith in God. It's a fierce battle because it involves huge issues, two in particular. One, the status of the universe. Is it created or not? And secondly, the status of human life. Is it made in God's image or not? Is everything reducible in the end to the physics and chemistry of matter? Or is there a living, intelligent, and transcendent God who creates and upholds the universe? So the central question is, which worldview is true? And where does science stand? Which way does it point? And the series, The God Question, in which I participated, that series of TV programs, DVDs, and study guides is designed precisely to do that, to put the evidence into the public sphere so that people can decide for themselves. I have believed all my life in public debate, but I do wish there was an even playing field in this country. So much pressure is put on believers in God that they feel that they're being marginalized. And when the huge public authority of science comes into play, many people have given up even articulating their faith in God in public. But there's an irony here, because if you look at the history of science, whose authority is called on here, the major pioneers of science, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and of course, being in Scotland, I'd better mention James Clerk Maxwell, regarded by many, by the way, as a Scottish Einstein. And it was he who had put on the door of the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge, the most famous laboratory in the world, Psalm 111, verse 2, "Great are the works of the Lord, sought out and studied by those who take delight in them." Those words are still there on the new Cavendish Laboratory. These men were believers in God. Now that's remarkable, isn't it? Because we're being told that science will be hindered by believing in God. And yet the towering pioneers of science, all of them believed in God. That raises a question: what has happened? Now, it's very important to realize that the rise of science is closely connected with Christianity. C.S. Lewis put it this way: men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. And your brilliant theologian, T.F. Torrance, said this: theology can still claim to have mothered throughout long centuries the basic beliefs and impulses which have given rise especially to modern empirical science, if only through its unflagging faith in the reliability of God the Creator and in the ultimate intelligibility of his creation. And the question is this: what's happened since the 17th century to the 21st, that we're now told that belief in God will be a hindrance? Well, there are a series of nettles here to be grasped. And the first one is the atheist delusion about the nature of God. You see, when we used to talk about God, when I was young last century, when we used to talk about God, we could reasonably assume that people understood what we meant. No longer. And I discovered, it took me a while to see it, that one of the biggest problems in the contemporary debate is not simply atheist confusion about science, but atheist confusion about the nature of God. What do I mean by that? You see, people like Hawking and Dawkins think that I believe in a God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. Now, of course, if God is simply a God like the ancient Greek god of thunder, who disappears when you do a little bit of research in atmospheric physics, then of course you have to choose between God and science, because that's the way you define God. Now, I'd like you to grasp this because it's vitally important. The definition of God is part of the problem. If you define God to be what I don't yet know scientifically, then you have to choose between God and science, because that's the way you've defined God. But that isn't the God of the Bible, is it? The God of the Bible is the transcendent creator who created the whole lot, the bits we do understand and the bits we don't. The second confusion is that God is the same kind of explanation as science is. Steve Jones, in the Times last Saturday, talked about in the past people said God did it, and since then scientists have begun to use logic rather than assertion. So there's exactly what he is claiming, that God is the same kind of explanation as science is, and we've got to choose between the two. But ladies and gentlemen, that's childish in its logical fallacy. That's like saying you've got to choose between electronics and James Logie Baird to explain television. I mean, that's simply absurd. The point is, to explain a television set, you have two kinds of explanation at least. The one is in terms of the physics and electronics. The other is in terms of James Logie Baird, the intelligence that designed it. And no amount of studying electronics will eliminate James Logie Baird from the equation. But that is exactly what Dawkins and so many others are doing. They do not understand that there are different kinds of explanation. There's explanation in terms of mechanism and law, and there's explanation in terms of agency. It's exactly the same with the universe. And that's why, of course, the Bible itself encourages science. Humanity was told as its first task to name the animals, and taxonomy is the basic intellectual discipline. The Bible isn't anti-science. God told people to do it. He wasn't going to do it for them. But the point is, no amount of investigation of a TV set can eliminate its inventor. That would be foolish thinking. And no amount of scientific study of the universe can eliminate God. Exactly the opposite is the case. When Isaac Newton discovered his law of gravity, he didn't say, oh, now I've got a law of gravity, I don't need God. Well, what did he do? He wrote the most brilliant book in the history of science, the Principia Mathematica, and he expressed in it the hope that a thinking person might be brought by reading it to believe in a deity. Because you see, the more Newton understood of the universe, the more he worshipped the genius of the God who did it that way. The more that Jim Dutton saw the beauty of the universe through the window of the space shuttle, the more he admired the brilliance of the God that did it that way, not the less. I mean, it stands to reason. The more you understand of engineering, the more you can admire a space shuttle engine, not the less. We get it upside down because there's a fundamental confusion that's deliberately been driven through the heart of our culture, that it's either God or science. And once you start to explain anything else but the universe, you can see through that fallacy immediately. Another confusion, another nettle we need to grasp is, and it was referred to by the moderator, a confusion over what we mean by faith. I am a man of faith, thinks Richard Dawkins, and that's an insult, because what he means by that is that I believe where there's no evidence. It was rather fun debating Peter Singer some time ago in Melbourne, Australia, because I confessed to the audience, as I usually do, that my parents were Christian and my grandparents, and I'm a Christian. And he got up and he said, well, of course, that's it. That's the fundamental objection I have to faith in God, that people tend to believe what their parents believed. So when I got the chance to say something, I said, Peter, I think the audience would be interested in your parents. Were they atheists? He said, yes, they were. Oh, I said. So you have remained in the faith in which you were brought up. Oh, but he said it isn't a faith. Oh, I said, sorry, Peter, I thought you believed it. But ladies and gentlemen, that's staggering. This is a world-class philosopher. And he doesn't understand that his atheism is a belief system. That's the problem in the United Kingdom today. We Christians, we have a belief system. We're people of faith. Atheists, they don't have a belief system. That is absolutely and very dangerous nonsense. People say, well, the default position is atheism. That is a belief system. They believe it. And the question we need to ask is their faith based on evidence? Is our faith based on evidence? That's why I get a bit worried when people talk about faith and science, because you see, science depends on faith. Faith, we've been deceived into thinking, is a religious concept which means believing where you know there's no evidence. That isn't true. At least in the biblical sense, it isn't true. The Christian faith is based on evidence. The Big Bang that was referred to, of the resurrection that happened in space, time, and history, is the evidence upon which rational faith can be based. I wouldn't stand here a moment if I didn't believe that. You see, it's an evidence-based faith. And I ask the same question of atheism. Is it evidence-based? And this is a very interesting thing, because atheism seems to me to be a very sophisticated delusion. Let me try and argue that too. I know it's very late at night for logic and arguments, but you just have to put up with it for a moment. What does the atheist do his science with? Mind. What is the mind? Well, I'm told by my atheist friends that the mind is the end product of a series of natural processes which are unguided and unintelligent. Oh, I see. And you trust that to do science? Do you know, I have never met a scientist who would trust a computer for a microsecond if she thought that it was the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Now, my chief objection, therefore, to atheism is not that it's anti-God. It's that, by definition, it's anti-science, ladies and gentlemen. Because it pulls the carpet, it pulls the ground for trusting in the mind to do the science. Now, this argument is so important, it is now being discussed by one of America's leading philosophers who is an atheist. And that's the interesting thing. Mind and Cosmos by Thomas Nagel, a fascinating book. And he points out that if you reduce everything, mind included, to physics and chemistry, you destroy all rationality, and there's the end of science. This is a serious argument. Lewis saw it, of course, years ago, because he was very bright, and several people have seen it since. But now it's coming into focus even on the part of atheists. Let me repeat that the atheist position, followed to its logical conclusion, takes away the ground for doing science. Now, this goes back to the connection between Christianity and the rise of science. It was belief in an intelligent, rational God that led to people believing that it might perhaps be possible to understand the universe out there, because they believed that ultimately the universe out there and the human mind in here were attributable to the same rational God. Now, this debate matters, and I'm delighted that we've got these resources, particularly that they're even-handed, because they can be used to stimulate thinking about these things and to clear away the fog. We need to grab nettles, but we need to clear away the fog, and we can all be involved in doing that. I just want to make two more points. The first is this: that the debate matters to everybody because ideas have consequences. We live in a country where we benefit from a huge legacy of the Judeo-Christian heritage. Legal system, hospitals, hospices, and universities and schools. Even atheists admit that. Jürgen Habermas, one of the leading atheist thinkers in Germany, says this: the individual morality of conscience, human rights, and democracy are the direct legacy of the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. To this day, there is no alternative to it. We continue to draw on the substance of this heritage. Everything else is just idle post-modern chatter. Why should we throw this legacy away by keeping silent in the public space about it and about its importance? Because, ladies and gentlemen, it is virtually empirically observable that if you deny the transcendent dimension in morality and ethics, You have to find your morality and ethics down here. And you're going to either find it in sociology, in evolutionary philosophy, or somewhere, or in genetics. It's no wonder we're in a mess. Famous entomologist E.O. Wilson: no species, ours included, possesses a purpose beyond the imperatives created by its own genetic history. We have no particular place to go. The species lacks any goal external to its own biological nature. Morality, or strictly our belief in morality, is merely an adaptation put in place to further our reproductive ends. Hence, the basis of ethics does not lie in God's will. In any important sense, ethics, as we understand it, is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. Now, I want you to listen to this next bit very carefully. Ideas of consequences. Dostoevsky said a long time ago in his brilliant novel, The Brothers Karamazov, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. He didn't mean atheists couldn't behave. Of course they can, because from where I sit, every person, atheist or not, is a human being made in the image of God and therefore a moral being. He was saying there is no rational base for morality if you get rid of God. Now, this is the end of the logic of atheism. And I go back to Dawkins. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. That is what is being taught, ladies and gentlemen. And if you teach a few generations of kids that, they'll start to believe it. That if they turn a gun on their classroom mates, they're just dancing to the music of their DNA. How are we going to stem the tide? Because what we're seeing written on the page of European history is what Nietzsche led us to expect. That once you get rid of God, you'll in the end get rid of man. And you lose all sense of a value for human beings. The high price that we pay for secularist atheism is the devaluation and the eventual annihilation of human significance. Listen to Peter Singer, whom I debated. There's no reason to think that a fish suffers less when dying in a net than a fetus suffers during an abortion. Hence, the argument for not eating fish is much stronger than the argument against abortion. Or again, the life of a newborn baby is of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. What are we going to do about it? That's the challenge that I'm faced with all the time. And time is running out because there's a huge tidal wave of secularism flowing over our country. And it's knocking people for six and knocking their confidence in God from under their feet. So what do we do about it? We have to stand up, ladies and gentlemen. We have to overcome the fear barrier. The Apostle Peter says to all of us who are Christian, always be ready to give an answer to anybody that asks you concerning the hope that is within you. But I haven't started in the right place. A bit further forward, he says, don't be afraid. We're all afraid. We've all got a level of fear. And we need to fight our way through it. Otherwise, we'll be left with a silent generation who have nothing to say into the current culture. And that's where I believe, in conclusion, that the God Question series can really help you to get involved. We've heard of it being shown on Norwegian television. We've heard of it being used in churches. And I want to encourage you to have dinner parties in your homes. Oh, but you say I can never run a discussion. You don't have to. I guarantee if you show any excerpts from this, a discussion will flow without you enabling it at all. And we've seen this again and again and again. Indeed, when I'm asked to speak, 99% of the time or more, I say no. I say I can suggest something better. Use this kind of material. Show it to your friends or in your church and choose members out of your congregation to answer the questions. And I remember one minister saying to me, oh, but we don't have any such people. I said, I didn't hear that. If you haven't got people like that in your church, you're not doing your job properly. Then he said, oh, we got so-and-so and so-and-so. So I said, do me a favour and contact me when it's all over. So about 8 weeks later, he wrote me a letter. And it went like this: Dear Professor Lennox, thank you so much for not coming. We made a spectacular mess of it. We had 5 people. They got into such a mess that one of the Christians in the front row looked at the audience and he said to them, you know, we don't seem to know as much about this than you do. Why don't we just start an exploring Christianity group from next week? There are 39 atheists in that group now, today, going on as a result of that one evening. And I firmly believe that if you grasp the fear nettle, it's the biggest nettle this evening. It's the biggest. It's the elephant in the room. If you grasp the fear nettle and use this stuff, but you say you find it all easy. No, I don't. When I started in Cambridge, I had a thing that most of you have never seen. It's called a tape recorder. And it had huge big reels. I didn't know how to answer questions. So what did I do? I invited my fellow students in to hear 10 minutes of a good talk. And once I begun to see them become Christians, to discover that they could change their worldview, that transformed me. So it'll be useless this evening if we all go home, we get a copy of this, and we're asked in a year's time, what did we think of it? And we say, we enjoyed it, you know, Ian and Karen, we really enjoyed it. That's useless, ladies and gentlemen. We have a responsibility to get the message of God credibly, articulately, in reasoned, rational communication out into the world at every single level. Not all of us can debate, but all of us can use debates. Not all of us can interview Stephen Weinberg, but all of us can use the interviews. And so I want to suggest to you that you don't leave tonight without taking a copy, not to enjoy, but to use, and you encourage people to use it, because in my experience of life, there's something wonderful about seeing people of all ages empowered. I was working on NASA Standard Time, by the way, and I've gone on to when I thought I should have finished if you'd started at the right time. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.